Alright, so for my intellectual biography, I chose to do Leigh Howard Stevens. Um, First, a bit about Leigh and why he is so important to the marimba world is his development of the Stevens technique, which is pictured here. Um, it is the grip that most marimbists, about 80-90% of four mallet marimba players, will use the Stevens grip. He also popularized Birch Handles before his performance in 1976 at the Percussive Art Society International Convention. Um, he, like, Birch Handles were essentially not on the market. He also is the author of the most influential um, method book for marimba, the Method of Movement for Marimba. Um, so, in third grade, Leigh wanted to play saxophone in the band, but his band director decided that he would play drums instead because he thought it more fit his personality. So, Leigh didn't really show much enthusiasm for it at first, but fairly quickly, about a couple of weeks, he decided to get much more involved. And he really started enjoying it. And he did that for several years. His first experience with mallet instruments was in preparation for the All-State Orchestra audition in his senior year of high school. For the audition, he was required to have an excerpt prepared for snare drum, timpani, and xylophone. The snare drum, of course, he was already very familiar with, but the timpani and specifically the xylophone was very challenging for him because at this point, Leigh didn't really read music. He had to write "Every Good Boy Does Fine" along the lines of the staff just so he could know which pitch was which on the staff. At the audition, his first introduction to the marimba was through Scott Bleakin, who was another candidate. He played his xylophone excerpt on the marimba and down an octave, and Leigh thought that sounded so much better. Um, in an interview with Michael Burritt, he recalls crawling under the instrument to look up the resonators, which are the tubes of metal underneath the keyboard, to see where there was a speaker, because Leigh didn't believe that an instrument that was that resonant could be strictly acoustic. He thought it had to have a speaker somewhere, and when he couldn't find one, he was really impressed and fell in love with the instrument. Through the development of his technique, it really started when he began playing with four mallets from the very beginning. This is not something that's typically done because usually aspiring mallet percussionists will typically spend several years developing their two mallet skills just so they are much more familiar with the instrument for when they step up to four mallets. Leigh decided to start practicing with four mallets from the very beginning, which was fine for him because he didn't really have a formal teacher and he just wanted to do what the pros did. He had no idea of what techniques were very difficult or what was standard for him to learn at his particular time in his development. So he took on very challenging skills the same way he took on very easy ones. They were all the same to him. As far as what grips he used, he started with a traditional crossed grip, and then after a year and a half switched to a modified Burton grip, which is common for jazz vibraphonists because it allows for very powerful two mallet playing to cut over the band while still allowing for four mallets when needed for chords. And then a couple months before his studies with Vida Chenoweth in the summer of 1972, he was asked to switch to the Musser grip for his study. But he didn't really like the Musser grip just because it it was a palm down grip as opposed to a palm sideways grip. And he didn't like the point of pivot of the mallets, so he decided to modify the Musser grip because he still saw the benefit of the mallets being uncrossed in the hand, which is greater mallet independence. So he created the Stevens grip, which is pictured here. Another big development was Birch Handles, and this also happened during relatively the same time. Dave Mancini, one of his friends and a great drummer, handed him a pair of the Jose Bethencourt mallets in a practice room one day, and he tried them, and because of the new grip he had developed, he found that they were very beneficial and he could play much more accurately because of the extra length and stiffness. This is really only because the Stevens grip is much more flexible, and the muscles that would grant the grip stability are not really developed until after several years of playing with the technique. So the extra stiffness of the mallets will increase the accuracy. After his performance at PASIC, the Percussive Art Society International Conference, in 1976, which is his debut performance, Vic Firth approached him about the mallets, wanting to sell them because he saw how successful they were. And since then, about 75% mallets have used the Birch handle, which is now the standard for marimba mallets. His study with Vida Chenoweth is what Stevens describes as his the time where he had the most growth. First, Vida was the first concert marimbist, and she was responsible for elevating the marimba to the levels of violin and piano in solo classical work. Stevens studied under her for 4 months, which is a long time, especially for how many hours a day he put into the instrument. 6 hours a day, 3 days a week is pretty extreme. And it is very clear because of that why Stevens grew so much during these 4 months. He was pushed very hard in terms of musicality, interpretation, and techniques that he could use, and the Vida is responsible for most of his growth, as well as, of course, his professors at Eastman. The method of movement for marimba, outside of his grip, is probably Stevens' biggest contribution to the marimba world, because it is long-standing and will outlast him. The 42 years after its publication, it is still standard curriculum for marimba study. It details exactly how to use the Stevens technique, and how to utilize that technique with all the strokes used to play marimba. He also gives a large compilation of exercises that he had written for his students over the years, which will help develop the technique and provide a solid foundation of skills to learn more advanced techniques. And then his other contributions to the music world include the instrument and mallet design, especially after Vic Firth approached him about mallets. He started his own company when he needed to publish his book, and has a line of mallets. He has also designed a marimba for Musser, and more recently has designed vibraphones for Malletech, and is really a big figure in the instrument design field. He also has many performances across several PASICs and internationally at his own recitals, and he puts on a marimba seminar and a marimba competition every summer in order to really further the field. All the research was taken from his interview with Michael Burritt, and that was published in Percussive Notes, and his article, his bibliographic article in the Percussive Art Society when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame.